Great to see you all coming in. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands and islands that make up Australia. I particularly wish to acknowledge the traditional owners of Ngunnawal country, where I live here in Canberra, and I acknowledge the elders past and present and their enduring connection to country, no matter how it changes. I want to welcome you to the second in our series of 2 webinars that are being co-hosted this week by the National Environmental Science Program's Climate Adaptation Cross-Hub Program and Griffith University's Climate Action Beacon. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Sarah Bolter. I'm an Associate Professor of Climate Adaptation at the University of Tasmania, and I also lead the NESP Climate Adaptation Cross-Hub Program. So on behalf of myself and the Beacon's Director, Brendan Mackey, I want to thank you for joining us in this second webinar of unpacking the findings of the 6th assessment of the IPCC Working Group 2. Working Group 2 focuses on how climate change is already affecting society and communities, future risks, and how well we are currently adapting or preparing to adapt. As I said on Wednesday, this new report represents the efforts of over 270 experts who collectively examined over 34,000 peer-reviewed publications. It's not an insignificant effort. It's not all good news, but it's certainly not unexpected. 4 of the report authors have kindly agreed to join us to give a brief overview of the findings of the report and answer your questions. For those of you who weren't able to join us on Wednesday, our webinar included presentations by Professor Brendan Mackey, the co-coordinating lead author of the Australasia chapter, and his colleague, Professor Greta Petzel from University of Tasmania. If you missed the webinar, the recording can be found on the Climate Systems Hub YouTube channel, and we'll pop the link to that in the chat. Today, we want to focus on projected risks, given levels of global warming, and also the adaptation solutions, including understanding some of the barriers and limits to the possible adaptation solutions. We have 2 speakers. I'll begin by introducing our first speaker, Kevin Hennessy. Kevin has been involved in climate change research for almost 35 years. He spent 30 years at the CSIRO and he's now a consultant. His expertise is in regional climate projections for Australia and the Asia Pacific region. This includes climate products and services that raise awareness and inform impact assessment for decision making. And he was obviously one of the lead authors of the Working Group 2 chapter on Australasia. So with that, I'll hand it over to you. Thanks, Kevin.
Thank you, Sarah. And can I just check that you can see my slide?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
All good. I'd like to start by providing some context. So we've talked about some of the structural process for the IPCC in the last webinar. Now we're going to move into talking about some of the key risks. Getting a delay with changing the slide for some reason. Apologies for the delay. There we go. So the context is by starting to look at some of the observed trends and what those trends mean for extreme events. We have seen a global warming of about 1.1 degrees since 1900. And in Australia, we've seen a warming of slightly larger than that, 1.4 degrees. And that's shown in the time series graph on the left-hand side. So we can see lots of wiggles and bumps indicating the year-to-year variability, but a very slow and gradual increase in temperature over the last century. It's slightly faster than that in New Zealand. And this has been associated with an increase in heat waves, more fire weather days, especially in southern and eastern Australia, and an increase in sea level, which has accelerated to about 3.4 millimetres per year since 1993. Now, that average warming has led to a number of extreme events, including Australia's hottest year in 2019, with a record-breaking number of days over 39 Celsius. We've seen widespread marine heat waves from 2016 to 2020, and of course the major fires in southern and eastern Australia in 2019 and 2020, which had major impacts. With regard to rainfall, the maps on the left-hand side here show trends from 1960 to 2019 in percent per decade. The top map is for summer from December to Feb, and the bottom map is for winter from July to August. And you can see that there's been an increase in summer rainfall in the north and west, and a decrease in winter rainfall in the southwest and the southeast. In particular, our report says that the April to October rainfall has decreased 16% since the 1970s in the southwest, and it's decreased 12% since about 2000 in the southeast. So these are substantial decreases. And you can see the time series of those changes on the far left-hand side for Northern Australia, Southwest WA, and Southeastern Australia. Interestingly, despite the decrease in average rainfall in winter months, there's been an increase in daily rainfall intensity associated with thunderstorms. Now, associated with these general trends have been particular extreme events, such as 3 major floods during 2019 to 2021. That doesn't include the most recent floods in southeast Queensland and New South Wales. We've seen the millennium drought from 1997 to 2009, and the more recent drought from 2017 to 2019. And 2019 was, in fact, Australia's driest year on record. So moving from what's been observed to what's projected for the future, we expect further warming with more hot days, fewer cold days and less snow, more sea level rise, and ocean acidification, which is caused by the absorption of higher levels of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere into the ocean. We expect continuing decreases in winter and spring rainfall in southern Australia, more winter rainfall in Tasmania, but less summer rainfall in Western Tasmania, and less autumn rainfall in southwestern Victoria. But there's a large amount of uncertainty about the direction of rainfall change in northern Australia. With the generally warmer and drier conditions in the south and east, we expect more extreme fire weather and more droughts. We also expect an increase in the heavy rainfall intensity. If there's any good news, it is that there will be fewer tropical cyclones, but a greater proportion of severe cyclones when they form. And there's a lot of detail about the quantified projections in table 11.3 in our report for those who want to check it out. I wanted to just give a bit of background about some risk concepts. Risk is defined by the IPCC as the interaction between hazard, exposure, and vulnerability. I've been talking about climate hazards. These are the weather and climate impacts that are being observed as we speak. Some of these are acute, like the extreme weather events. Some of them are chronic, such as the gradual increase in temperature or the gradual decrease in rainfall in the south. But interacting with those hazards is exposure. And this is essentially things that we value that may be adversely affected. And you can see examples of those such as people or infrastructure. In addition, vulnerability is the propensity or the predisposition to be adversely affected. So all of these three things are incredibly important. Hazard, we can manage through reducing greenhouse gas emissions to slow global warming. Vulnerability and exposure can be addressed through adaptation. So let's talk about some of the impacts and projected risks. Our report concludes that climate trends and extreme events have combined with exposure and vulnerabilities to cause major impacts for many natural systems and human systems. Where possible in our report, the impacts and risks have been quantified for different timeframes and emission scenarios, or different levels of global warming, to provide a sense of magnitude and timing, and therefore an indication of the level of urgency to act. The graph on the left-hand side there is showing global average warming relative to the pre-industrial period, which is 1850 to 1900. And you can see in the black line, that's the global warming that's been observed, with a range of uncertainties shown as a grey shading. And then we move into the future for different greenhouse gas emission scenarios. In blue is a very low emission scenario. through to the dark red, which is a very high emission scenario. You can see the warming ranges from best case, about 1.5 degrees by the end of the century, worst case up to about 5 degrees. So the emission scenarios have a very large impact on global warming and therefore on the impacts. In our report, we identified 9 key risks based upon 4 criteria. We looked at the magnitude of the impacts and risks, the likelihood that they may occur, the timing, and the level of adaptive capacity. And this took into account peer-reviewed literature and other reports, as well as expert judgment. The first 3 of these 9 risks are shown on the slide, the first of which is loss and degradation of coral reefs and associated biodiversity and ecosystem services. And this is due to ongoing ocean warming and marine heat waves. This is occurring right now, and this is one of our major risks. We've seen 3 marine heat waves on the Great Barrier Reef during 2016 to 2020, and that has already caused significant bleaching and coral loss. The second key risk is the loss of alpine biodiversity in southeastern Australia due to a reduction in snow. And for example, we've already seen loss of alpine vegetation communities and increased stress on snow-dependent species. The third key risk is a transition or collapse of 4 types of forests. These are alpine ash, snow gum woodlands, pencil pines, and the northern jarrah forests. And this is right across southern Australia due to hotter and drier conditions with more fires. So for example, we've seen declining rainfall in southern Australia. That's led to drought-induced canopy dieback. And we've also seen the death of fire-sensitive tree species due to the mega fires that occurred in 2019. The fourth key risk is loss of kelp in southern Australian oceans and in southeastern New Zealand oceans due to warming, marine heat waves, and overgrazing by climate-driven range extensions of herbivore fish and urchins. So we've already seen that there's less than 10% of giant kelp left in Tasmania since 2011 due to ocean warming. The fifth key risk is the loss of natural and human systems in low-lying coastal areas due to sea level rise. And for example, for 0.5 metre of sea level rise, the current 1 in 100 year coastal flood could occur several times a year. The sixth risk is disruption and decline in agricultural production and associated stress in rural communities in southwestern, southern and eastern mainland Australia. And this is due to hotter and drier conditions with more droughts. So for example, a projection by 2050 is for a decline in median wheat yields of up to 30% in southwest WA and up to 15% in South Australia. And for livestock, we expect increased heat stress by 31 to 42 days per year. The seventh key risk is an increase in heat-related mortality and morbidity for both people and wildlife due to heat waves. For example, a projection is that heat-related deaths in Melbourne, Sydney and Brisbane may increase by up to 300 people per year for a low emission pathway and up to 600 people per year for a high emission pathway during 2031 to 2080. And that's relative to a current average of about 140 people dying due to heat waves per year. So that's a big increase. The eighth key risk is a relatively new one, but we're seeing it play out as we speak. And this is the cascading, compounding and aggregate impacts on cities, settlements, infrastructure, supply chains and services due to wildfires, floods, droughts, heat waves, storms and sea level rise. So for example, with the fires in 2019-2020, these burned a large area with 114 listed species losing at least half of their habitat. Over 3,000 houses were destroyed. 33 people were killed directly by the fires, but a further 429 people died due to cardiovascular and respiratory conditions. and there were major economic losses across a large number of sectors. The ninth key risk is the inability of our institutions and governance systems to manage climate risks. So this is an implementation risk or a response risk. And this is because the scale and scope of projected climate impacts may overwhelm the capacity of our institutions, organisations and systems to provide the necessary policies, services, resources and coordination to address the impacts. And indeed, we see this with almost every one of our disasters. We're not very good at managing these risks. I'll conclude by saying something about the so-called burning ember diagrams in our report. These are a graphic way of visualising how the risks may change over time for different levels of global warming. I've just got a sample of 3 of them on this slide. And these are for heat-related mortality on the left, cascading impacts in the middle, and the failure of our institutions to manage climate risks on the right. The different colours represent different risk categories, where white is an undetectable risk, so we haven't seen it yet. Moderate is in yellow, high risk is in red, and very high risk is in purple. And you can see that the tendency for those risks to increase as the level of global warming progresses. They're indicative. They are based upon an assessment of the available literature, but also based upon our expert judgment. And there's a lot more detail and supporting information in our supplementary material. We've looked at outcomes for both low and moderate levels of adaptation, with the latter including both incremental and transformative adaptation options. And you'll also notice that the confidence ratings are shown as dots, where 3 dots is very high confidence, 2 dots is medium, and 1 dot is low confidence. And again, this is based upon the level of evidence that's available and the degree of agreement between lines of evidence. So for example, if we looked at the heat-related mortality, we see that there's relatively moderate risk for 1 degree of global warming, which is about now, moving to high risk for 2 degrees of global warming, and very high risk for 3 degrees of global warming. The rate of change is slightly different for the cascading impacts. Again, we felt that through our assessment, we move into the red zone of high risk for about 1.2 degrees of global warming, which is not far away. That's within the next 10 years. And likewise for the failure of institutions and governance systems. We're seeing it happen right now, and it's going to become a high risk within the next 10 years. Moderate adaptation, you'll see with each of these examples, buys time. It extends the global warming at which those different categories of risk occur. So you might delay the effect of that particular risk by about half a degree of global warming for moderate adaptation. So there's benefit in adaptation. The other 6 risks are now shown, and you can see that on the top left, we've got loss and degradation of coral reefs. This is the one where we're already seeing high risk for less than 1 degree of global warming. And bear in mind, we've already seen 1.1 degree of global warming. So we're moving into and experiencing very high risk right now. And the scope for adaptation is limited. So the purple area on both of those bars for coral reefs is very extensive. So there's a limited amount of adaptation that will be effective. Likewise for kelp forests and for alpine biodiversity, we're pretty much in the high risk right now with limited scope for adaptation. The forest ecosystems, there's a bit more range of uncertainty. We're in the moderate risk range right now, moving to high risk by 2 degrees warming. And with loss of systems in low-lying coastal areas, again, we're in moderate risk territory right now. And by about 2.5 to 3 degrees of global warming, we move to high risk. And this is because sea level rise is relatively gradual. And finally, with the decline of our agricultural production systems, again, we're currently in the moderate risk zone, moving to high risk between 2 and 2.5 degrees of global warming. So happy to talk more about that later in the chat, but I'm going to stop sharing my screen now and hand over to Lauren to talk about adaptation options and challenges.
Great, thanks, Kevin. A very sobering presentation. Thank you. I'm sure it's going to prompt a lot of questions. And just a reminder to use the Q&A function if you have any questions. We'll come to questions at the end of Lauren's presentation, and we do also have Brendan Mackey and Greta Petzel from our Wednesday webinar waiting to also join that panel discussion. So let me introduce Professor Lauren Rickards. She's a human geographer. She specialises in examining the social dimensions of climate change, particularly in water and agri-food sectors, and with collaborators in other disciplines and organisations. She is the director of the Urban Futures Platform at RMIT University. She advises a wide range of groups of government, business and NGO sectors on climate change issues. She's also one of the lead authors from the Australasia chapter. So Lauren, delighted to have you. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Sarah. And yeah, thanks everyone for being here. And I'd like to start by acknowledging that I'm coming from the lands, the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and thanks for the care they show country. So as Sarah said, it's a sobering message. And I think, you know, if there's one sentence to summarise what it is that we're saying with this report, it is that we need to urgently mitigate and urgently adapt. So what is it that adaptation can do? What is the adaptation challenge? So as Kevin said, the way that climate risk, climate change challenges are conceptualised in the IPCC is to understand them as a collision between climatic changes, the climatic related hazards, as well as questions of exposure, which are both spatial and sort of in that long-term sense of settlement patterns, which as a geographer I'm very interested in, but also more temporary things like which road you happen to be on when there's a traffic jam, as we saw in the bushfires, and also exposure in terms of which systems, which infrastructural systems and networks we're part of, and how we get exposed through those sorts of networks. And then, of course, vulnerabilities, which is everything else. What else is going on in our lives? What else is going on in different institutions? And so one way to think about the adaptation challenge is the need to actually outpace the proliferation of risk across those three different categories. Because one of the really important things to understand is that climate change is not just about climatic change. It's actually also worsening exposures. We don't need to look further than the horrific floods going on right now to see how quickly exposure can occur. But also those vulnerabilities, it's worsening vulnerabilities. So people carrying within their lives the impacts of previous climatic hazards, previous stresses created through and co-generated through climate change. So the challenge for adaptation is to outpace that. And the thing about those three different pillars of climate impacts, if you like, is that each of those points to opportunities for adaptation. We have, overly focused on the reduction, technical reduction on some of the climatic hazards, which is not to, mitigation is separate to this, but we've had a strong focus on hazard-specific adaptation, which points to the fact that we're building on a strong base, particularly strong base in Australia in disaster risk reduction, which we need to support, but we need to diversify out from that, think more broadly about how we can work to alter in positive ways exposures from long-term land use planning through to more temporary things like, or I should say more immediate things, such as the provision of, say, social housing, and how we can really work on vulnerability reduction, which is a very, very big challenge. And one of the things that we have really emphasised in this chapter, but also more broadly is a theme across the broader report, is the ways in which impacts are becoming much more complex. They're cascading, they're compounding, they're aggregating up at things like national economic levels as well. And that's because of the very, very systemic networked nature of our society And let's not forget that all of us here in this webinar right now are highly reliant on a very intricate array of infrastructure and essential services, and that sort of connection, which often we sometimes imagine because it's digital that it's somehow immaterial, is also very much vulnerable to climate change impacts, as that image from the University of Tassie in 2018 floods illustrates. And so when you think about that and you think about the reliance on digital computing, ICT, just as one example of infrastructure, you think about the reliance we have on that for our disaster response and adaptations, but then the fact that it is in and of itself vulnerable to climate change and hazards and disruptions, you get to start to sense the kind of spirals that we face. But that said, since 2014, when the 5th assessment report was finished, now we've got a lot more evidence of a lot more adaptation. So focusing across Australia, you know, there's very strong examples of greater ambition in adaptation. It's much more normal. You know, for a while it was taboo to talk about. It's now much more normalised. Greater breadth of adaptation across those different paradigms, away from hazard-specific adaptation to looking at some of these broader, more systemic questions, and a faster rate of change across governments, non-governments, businesses and communities. So some of the things that have been going on that everyone on this call would be most familiar with, you know, there's been work to clarify roles, responsibilities. There's been a host of vulnerability and risk assessments. I think climate change adaptation, vulnerability, risk assessments, adaptation isn't, you know, a burgeoning industry in that sense. And a lot of that has worked to improve our understanding of what strategies and options are available, engage all of the various stakeholders that are necessary to come up with effective adaptation strategies, prepare plans and start to mainstream those plans into wider core business, which of course is where adaptation needs to be. It can't be off to the side like some kind of ESG type strategy. And so across the different sectors, we see a whole range of efforts. State governments have been very active. I'm familiar with the work going on in the Victorian government, where there's a systems approach. 7 different systems have produced adaptation actions, as well as place-based approach. So state governments facilitating regions and local areas to do place-based adaptation as well. And that's occurring in Victoria, South Australia, all over the place. We're getting a whole lot of really great work of groups coming together to think about what their region or local community can do. And that's particularly evident around coastal adaptation for various reasons to do with risk and also institutional legacies. Some of that work has started to move in really creative ways towards visioning and planning, learning across networks. From a more sort of sober perspective, including some global drivers in the business sector, we're seeing new climate risk disclosure, expectations, norms, regimes, with some very strong messaging coming around that. So banks, for example, are starting to sit up and take notice and think about what their risk is across different asset classes. We've had some work at the national level. We've got the disaster risk reduction framework. And of course, we're really working to think about adaptation in all sorts of adaptation in terms of different ecosystems and all sorts of other realms as well. Now, one thing to emphasise is that while this activity is obviously highly positive and very something to really encourage, at the same time, we can't say that adaptation activity leads necessarily to positive adaptation outcomes. And that's something that the report more broadly, particularly chapter 16, really emphasises. The other thing is, of course, what counts as success in adaptation is very much a factor of what goals you're trying to pursue there, climate risk reduction being one among many goals, different perspectives on what is adequate, what is an acceptable level of climate risk, the scale at which you're looking, and some of those tensions play out in some of the sort of governance tensions, and of course the time scale. So things that look good today, including perhaps, for example, flood measures that have been put in since recent floods may prove actually not to be adequate after all. It's also important to note that, of course, some of these initiatives are themselves endangered, and one of the issues that we've seen in the Australian context is that some of our best adaptation work has itself not persisted. One of the things that this points to is the really, really vital role of monitoring and evaluation and the ongoing adaptation of adaptation in the world of adaptation. And what we're seeing is that while we have an increasing array of plans, there's a need for some of those to be refreshed. Some of them are getting a little bit outdated. And we also perhaps need to start thinking in more experimental ways, actually thinking outside the box of some of the more established ways of doing things. I wouldn't be a good academic if I didn't endorse the need for more research, and there's certainly a vital need, particularly for empirical research to understand climate change impacts, and of course more forums such as this to share insights and practical action. So while there is clear evidence of a range of activity around adaptation, the take-home message is that we need to do more, a lot more. And so here's just a number of the sorts of quotes that you'll find in the thousands of pages of the document. The first from our own chapter, chapter 11, talking about the observed adaptation in the region, noting that most of it is largely incremental, by which we mean a slight change from the standard way of doing things, not a radical change. But when you think about the ways in which climate risks are accelerating, they're compounding and they're cascading, as Kevin indicated, and that's across all the different domains, then you can see that we can, clearly come to the conclusion that a step change in adaptation ambition is needed. This is something that's reinforced in other parts of the report, including the first chapter, which lays out the adaptation challenge. And for those of you more academically minded, I encourage you to read chapter 1. And one of the things I just wanted to highlight there is that the adaptation gap particularly requires actions over the next few years by governments, business, civil society and individuals at a scale and speed significantly faster than that represented by our current trends. So there's a major risk that rather than the sort of, I guess, older idea that we fail to start adaptation, that sort of sense of adaptation as some kind of switch, that actually we're going to be doing too little too late. And we really, really need to think very, very carefully about the timing of adaptation. We're seeing that delays in adaptation are leading already to costly and damaging climate impacts, including in some cases irreversible losses, as Brendan talked about in the first seminar. We also know that delays in adaptation can create big legal problems for those with adaptation mandates, and also financial institutions as well. There's a risk that governments are going to become exposed, increasingly are becoming exposed to unsustainable fiscal risks as people turn to them to help cover recovery costs and to kind of ensure of last resort. It's a big topic there. We also know that delays in adaptation mean that those adaptations are simply being pushed into the future where they're going to be less voluntary, less fair and more disruptive, leading to more dysfunctional systems and actually undermining our capacity to mitigate or adapt. So what we mean is that delays in adaptation are extremely problematic. So this question of when we start is a very, very crucial one and a key message coming out from our chapter. Also, just to reiterate, as I started off by saying, that this goes hand in hand with the problem of delays in mitigation. And as Brendan, Greta and Kevin have all emphasised in their talks, the more climate change progresses, the more it gets out of hand, adaptation is less and less able to effectively reduce those climate change risks. Now, that said, what we need to do also is to recognise and seize the many benefits adaptation can generate. And this is where some of the best progress is going on. It's about actually asking very overdue questions about what it is we actually want in society. What sort of cities and settlements do we want? What sort of agricultural sector do we want? This is an opportunity to actually rethink things that have become very habitual, in some cases very rusted on, and actually think about the sort of wholesale change that's needed. So there's very strong evidence coming in that adaptation work, while perhaps initially motivated by reduction of climate risk, can actually substantially improve systems, creating all sorts of improvements in terms of health, well-being, social relationships. And I should say there, of course, progressing decolonisation, and of course, recognising the incredible Indigenous experience and knowledge that we have as this incredible sort of secret weapon, if you like, in the Australian context. We can really look at environmental questions, improve environmental quality, whether that's air quality, water quality, soil quality, improve ecosystems, including in that instrumental way of ecosystem services, but also more intrinsically. We can look at things like social inequalities and potential cost savings, and of course, there's energy savings and greenhouse gas savings. So one of the key things that's coming out more broadly around adaptation is that it's not just what you do, but it's also how you do it. And so it's about understanding that it's a process, not just because it's something that never ends, but also because the way in which we go about doing it, the relationships that we bring to bear in doing adaptation are both highly consequential for the outcomes, but also bring their own direct benefits. So what do we need to do? Well, we need to increase the scale, scope, and speed of adaptation, which is to say we need more transformational adaptation. That means we need to look across the who, the what, and the how of what we're doing and start to really, really step up. One of the things about the who, and by that I mean the kind of what is it that we're adapting, is that it's increasingly clear that we need to actually adapt the systems, the networks, the institutions, and the goals by which we operate. So it's not just simply kind of adding in a line on climate change risk to existing risk registers, for example, or adding on a climate adaptation officer to an existing organisation. It's about actually thinking about what we're doing and how we might need to change in a much more roots and branch type way. It's also about thinking about all the different groupings that we're part of. We're all part of supply chains. COVID's brought that home incredibly. We're all part of subsectors. We're all part of professions. We're all part of ecosystems. How are those things adapting? We need to move beyond the kind of habitual focus on households or organisations, or sometimes a short list of sectors, and actually start thinking about these other things that we're part of as well. There's a big gap in adaptation when it comes to the smaller organisations, businesses and settlements, and that's because of capacity issues, that's because of the other pressures, those vulnerability questions. And we now need to acknowledge that because climate change is progressing as we speak, people are already disadvantaged. And my heart goes out to any of you experiencing the current floods at the moment, and understand that we need to work from that starting point and really support those to recover and to get to a stronger footing in order to start adapting as well. And so there's that sort of sense where we're really doing disaster risk reduction at the same time as climate change adaptation. And that comes to the what. So we need to embed a very strong approach to disaster risk reduction in Australia within these larger preventative approaches. We need to be much more active. We need to think, perhaps most of all, of adaptation as holding open the range of options. The IPCC talks about the solution space. How can we keep options open? And that means we need to think about whether or not our current approaches to adaptation, not only are too limited in their reach, but actually perhaps too limited in their ambition. Are they fit for purpose, given the severity, the complexity, the boundary crossing nature of the impacts that we're already seeing? And this means some of our existing risk management tools that we've usually brought to bear on climate change themselves need to be changed. We need to think much more carefully about deep uncertainty and non-linearities, tipping points, etc. And then that question of the driving forces, the root causes and vulnerability reduction. So I have to speed up. And so we need to do this. One of the other messages around all of this is that not only is the process important because of who we involve and what voices we hear and the need to really be inclusive, but that if we do adaptation in a rushed or habitual non-thinking kind of way, we can actually create new problems. We can create greenhouse gases for one thing, but we can also create injustices as well as ineffective and complacent approaches. So we need to think carefully about doing adaptation well. And that means being responsive to feedback, coming back to that initial point I made about the need for monitoring, evaluation, and adaptation of adaptation. Okay, so just what that means at a sort of high level, because I know it's getting quite detailed, is we have to think about adaptation not just of the hardware of society, which is the typical way we've often thought about it, but as the software. And I mean that both metaphorically, but also given our high reliance on computing systems, literally as well. So why aren't we doing this? Why haven't we already started doing all of this? Well, one of the experiences of adaptation have been just how complex and difficult it is. And one of the main things the research literature throws up for us is a large number of reported barriers. These vary somewhat between different sectors. Understanding that, of course, the need for sectors to work together is part of the challenge. So when you think about the public sector, for example, let's imagine, for example, a local council. Sometimes there's a differences between that group, perhaps other scales of governance. It might be business interests, might be community interests. That actually means that adaptation conversation is complicated from the start. Add to that the fact that we see risk differently and that we work within different paradigms, from the kind of technical risk management through to broad root and branch change of society, dealing with social inequalities. You can sort of see some of the challenges. I won't go over this in great detail, just simply to say that, you know, the things are challenging, but a lot of these challenges are very, very familiar. They're challenges to a lot of successful public policy, a lot of successful private sector policy, business, government, strategic planning. And so we are familiar with them, and that means that we have a very strong sense of what some of the enablers are. And those enablers are summarised in our chapter in terms of broad sorts of things like getting the strong foundations right. When you think about the fact that vulnerability is one of the major, and I mean that by existing vulnerabilities, all the other non-climatic stuff is one of the major drivers of climate change risk and impacts, that means that one of the best things we can do is simply remove existing pressures. Okay, so that means removing pressures on the environment, removing pressures on society, on communities, on groups, on households, on disadvantaged individuals, in order to help create a strong foundation so that no matter what climate change throws at us, we're much more better placed to cope. And that's one of the founding principles of resilience, as many people here would know. We clearly need attitudinal change, and we need social demand for adaptation. We get a lot of demand for climate change mitigation, greenhouse gas mitigation, which is excellent. We need more of that too. But we also need demand for adaptation, particularly given that adaptation enables mitigation. We need those clear governance and legal arrangements that enable people to know what the rules of the game are. What are they playing? What are we doing? We need supportive relationships and learning from sort of small groups getting together going, oh my God, can you believe it? Through to, you know, communities of practice, conferences, summits, and again, events such as this. We need clear and accessible information guidance so that people are on the same page. One of the things about the boundary crossing nature of climate change risks and impacts means that if, for example, you have an array of local councils down a coastline, and only a couple of them in fragmented spaces actually see the climate change risk, particularly around sea level rise, for example, then you're going to have a limited degree of cooperation. And so to help with that cooperation, to help with the coordination, we need to have a common basis of information, and we need appropriate decision-making tools. That means both making existing tools more accessible, more user-friendly, but also thinking about whether the actual algorithms, the actual assumptions we're packing into some of that software, packing into those ideas, are actually fit for purpose given what climate change is throwing up to us. Now, overcoming these barriers is in and of itself one of the aspects of transformational adaptation. So in the IPCC report, they talk about transformational adaptation as being the stronger, broader, faster efforts, but also as being adaptation that in and of itself starts to overcome barriers. What we start to see here is the positive spiral that we can start to build. Just as I talked about the negative spiral at the start, this is the overcoming, this is the positive spiral. Of course, you know, the limit is that not overcoming those barriers freezes us and is in and of itself a major risk. I just want to emphasize again, this is the software point about the critical reflection, including for those of us in research. Are we talking about adapting the right things? Are we actually robust in our assumptions about what should or what will stay constant? And are we asking the right questions? Do we actually need to think about adapting some of our thinking around adaptation? And so to finish, overall, we need a systemic, purposeful, cooperative approach. The IPCC talks about the need for climate resilient and sustainable development, which is an integration of adaptation and mitigation. And I just want to focus on a couple of key points here. One is that adaptation is a responsibility for those of us who work and who live in ways that have other people relying on us, which is to say just about everyone here. And so because other people rely on us, they also rely on us adapting well. And those we rely on might need help adapting. So we really need to break out of our individualistic sense of adaptation. And I don't mean that just in terms of individual people, but also our sectors and our organisations, and think about those broader networks that we're part of. We also need to advocate for adaptation of our high level and shared systems. We saw that governance is a key barrier. We need to really get that sorted out, as well as a whole lot of other more shared systems such as cultural norms. We need to think about how we're contributing to adaptation of those. Overall, adaptation is vital to enabling the hard work of mitigation. If we're going to significantly and rapidly reduce emissions enough to keep global warming to 1.5 or 2 degrees, as we need to, if adaptation is to have a chance to succeed, then adaptation is needed to allow us to still work and function well enough to do that hard work. It's a positive feedback. And so overall, you can see there, we've got a choice between positive green sorts of pathways or overall negative red ones. It's pretty obvious we want to go with the top approach, and everyone here is busy working on it. So thanks for your time, and I look forward to questions. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Lauren. I think you pulled us a little bit out of the depression that Kevin popped us into. I think there's some really great messages in there, and that's not just downplaying the challenges that we're facing. So thank you so much for that. We've got panelists here, including Brendan Mackey and Greta Petzel from our Wednesday seminar. I'm going to throw out to a question, and sorry, Brendan, before the webinar, we kind of discussed this sort of question, and I think everyone was pointing at you to answer it. But we have a question about coastal and regional planning, and it's really talking about new policies being developed to stop building in floodplains, but also to relocate homes and businesses to higher ground. And we'd had a question before the webinar from our state and territory counterparts asking about retreat. You know, are we thinking about coastal retreat? Are we thinking of retreating from places of risks? So, you know, I just wanted to throw that out there. Is there information in the report, or is there thinking that's really thinking about, and maybe it leads a little bit to your question, your points around transformation, Lauren, you know, where are we going in this space around how some of those more difficult questions? You're on mute, Brendan.
I think after 2 1/3 years of doing nothing but Zooming, we'd all remember to click the unmute button. Yeah, of course, the coastal zone is naturally a very dynamic place. And, you know, one of the challenges we face with adapting to increasing climate-related risks is that we have this huge legacy of human settlement and infrastructure, which is housed in the coastal zone. So I live in Gold Coast City. It's a city of getting close to 700,000 people now, that's built in a linear fashion along about 34 kilometres of coastline. Most of it is in the coast, what was a coastal plain, now getting up into the more upland hinterland before the ridgetop of Springbrook, etc. But most of the coastal plain was a coastal wetland. right? There are vast areas of coastal wetland and major floodplains and major estuarine areas. So, you know, we have built a city in an area which is geographically exposed to many hazards. So it's a good case study in this regard. The risks are not just from sea level rise related impacts. It also has a very short, sharp coastal flowing catchments with very, very high rainfall of many thousands of metres at the top of the catchment. In fact, I think Springbook's 4,000 millimetres. So you're talking about a horizontal distance of 25 kilometres, and at the top of the catchment, you've got 4,000 metres of rainfall. So the risks of pluvial and fluvial flooding are probably greater than actually the risks from coastal inundation. And in fact, just this week in the suburb I live in, I actually live in an upland area, I'm up about 200 metres, but down on the flatter part, those suburbs had flooding because during the flash flooding, there was a high tide event and all the stormwater drains backflowed and rose up in the streets and flooded the houses. So, you know, adaptation has to deal with the local specifics of this. So, you know, we do point out in our chapter that there's really 4 adaptation strategies. There's the accommodate one, there's the defend one, there's the retreat, but there's also advance. There's also trying to somehow make use of or incorporate, you know, the changing circumstances into what you do. But I think, you know, Lauren made a really important point when she said exposure it's one dimension of exposure is geography, where you are spatially, and certainly we have these legacy issues of settlement and infrastructure that are now in the wrong place and will increasingly be in the wrong place. But certainly new developments, there is no excuse for new settlements and new commercial buildings and new infrastructure, hard infrastructure, to be located where there's current known hazards and or where hazards are projected to go into the future. But I think, and that's hard enough for all sorts of reasons we can go into that are outside the assessment of our report, I guess, in terms of what we covered. So I think we've got to think about it in terms of these 2 issues. What do we do with the legacy issue of where cities like the Gold Coast are located? They won't be moving inland anytime soon. And actually there's nowhere inland for them to move because it's a very short, sharp, steep escarpment that they face. And but secondly, what do we do? How do we actually change and put in place the strategic planning that's needed, you know, in particular at the local government level, so that we don't prevent, we don't create more harm and create more risk for people going forward. So, you know, in terms of how do local governments do that, it's a big challenge of how do you actually mainstream this kind of strategic thinking into their planning processes.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Brendan. And Kevin, it was one of the key risks that you highlighted, that this idea of where we live on the coast. Did you want to elaborate at all on that in this context?
I think Brendan's pretty much covered it, and there was a question in the Q&A about not only, you know, coastal exposure, but also exposure in floodplains, and I would argue also in sort of peri-urban areas with high fire risk. There are risky areas where we continue to develop, and looking at current risk levels and looking at future risk levels should inform what sort of planning guidelines and regulations should be put in place to build resilience rather than to make it worse. And we're seeing, you know, industry, for example, the insurance sector, starting to not only increase insurance premiums, but withdraw insurance from some areas that they deem to be too risky. So, you know, whether local councils and state governments change their planning regulations, the insurance sector is already acting. And that sends a signal to people in those areas. And it's often a tough message, especially right now, for example, in areas that are flooded where people have found that they don't have adequate insurance. That's soul destroying. But unfortunately, that is a message that I think we're going to get more and more in areas that are currently risky or that become more risky.
Thanks, Kevin. And I want to switch to the question of transformational adaptation, Lauren, and turn to you about this. I mean, you know, the report talks about transformational adaptation, and you alluded to this a bit. And there's a question here around, you know, we fund incremental action. What is it we need to make a case for transformational adaptation? You know, does this link into some of the points that Kevin's making around how do we deal with some of these existing risks and the market pressure on them?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you. I mean, that's a really, really key question. I guess I'd answer it in a couple of ways. One is to say that, you know, using the sorts of economic equations that Kevin just sort of pointed towards, the escalating costs of inaction, the relative economic sense of the transformational approaches would be one thing. And we have to remember that, you know, Australia loves a big infrastructure project. You know, we are able to fund those sorts of things. And one of the first things we need to do is make sure that we have no infrastructural developments, just as we have no new settlement developments that don't seriously consider high-end climate change scenarios. The other thing I would say that I really take away from that question is that internal sort of cultural software, if I can say that, of preferring those things that are tangible, that are reportable, that are quantifiable, etc. And this is where, you know, we actually need to think about the ways in which we assess success, the ways in which we sort of keep getting drawn into this short-term thinking, and it's across every workplace, I would say. And so can we sort of somehow shift the idea of what a good funding outcome looks like? Yes, something might be, you know, relatively intangible at the, you know, particular milestone mark that you need to report on. Yes, the benefits may not yet have been generated. You might be still in a big mess of construction, etc. But at least, you know, you've started on that road. And so it's about sort of thinking about those decision-making criteria that guide us, sometimes implicitly, sometimes explicitly, as well as the kind of actual case per se for transformational adaptation in any one sense. And the final thing to say is that, you know, one of the things about transformational adaptation, that piece about overcoming barriers, is that changing that sort of mindset, changing the ways in which we assess project proposals, the way in which we fund projects would in and of itself be transformational.
Yeah, that's terrific. Thanks, Lauren. Now, we are at the end of time, but we did start slightly late, so I'm going to take chair privilege, if I may, and just put to Kevin and Lauren the question that I put to Brendan and Greta on Wednesday. You know, what for you were the sort of big thing or that's changed between this report and the previous one? Kevin, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. Thanks, Sarah. I think we're putting a lot more emphasis in this report and our chapter in particular on adaptation solutions. You know, previously, there was a greater emphasis on, unfortunately, doom and gloom, so the observed impacts and the projected risks. I think we've shifted now more into the solution space, as Lauren alluded. And the other thing, which has come up in the chat as well, is this new key risk on essentially the implementation failure of institutions and governance systems. You know, we struggled with this one a little bit because it was so radically different, but the more and more I think about it, and the more I reflect on COVID and other disasters that have occurred, this is one of the major challenges. And it's not about risks that are just due to, you know, emerging hazards. This is the way in which we respond to a given hazard that is causing potential maladaptation or slowing down our ability to meet our resilience ambitions.
Brilliant. Thanks, Kevin. And Lauren, for you?
Yeah, well, building on that, I think, you know, I'd emphasise two main things. One is, as we've picked up, you know, to some degree in our chapter, and is certainly a very strong theme elsewhere in the chapter as well, is around the complexity of climate change impacts, including the cascading, the compounding. This is, you know, very much a kind of cutting edge area of the research. But added to that too, which perhaps I didn't emphasize enough, is that part of the complexity is because adaptation responses, not to mention every other sort of response, are feeding back into the very situation, which is then being impacted, basically co-creating those impacts. And understanding those feedbacks, I think, is a really, really key aspect, including when they fail. So understanding the ways in which perhaps, and I don't want to overemphasize kind of formal institutions here, like this is, you know, I'm in an academic institution, all of us are, you know, there's all sorts of informal institutions here, but when those sorts of things, including our norms and assumptions about what a good decision looks like, when they don't change, then that feeds back and co-creates impacts. One of the things I mentioned in brief, which gets a very strong focus elsewhere in the report, is the issue of maladaptation. So as I said, you know, it used to be that adaptation used to be a little bit more like mitigation, where because you've got a sort of common chemical basis, it's a little bit more clear cut. But it used to be the kind of, you know, starting horn kind of thing, right? Let's go. Okay, adaptation has started, bang. Whereas now we're understanding that actually it's about what you do in the name of adaptation, it's how you do adaptation well, and the need to avoid maladaptation. And one of the really strong emphases in chapter 1 that sets out the foundations for the whole report is the need to actually explicitly, actively and doggedly pursue equitable, just adaptation. So that's not sort of seeing those things as a co-benefit, which is sort of some of the other language, but understanding that this needs to be core to how we approach adaptation, or ultimately those adaptation outcomes won't be what they need to be.
Fantastic. That's brilliant. Thanks, Lauren. And Brendan, it's been a long few years for you. You and Judy Lawrence have done an amazing job bringing together the Australasia chapter. So I'm going to give you the last word. But you'll have to come off mute if you want the last word.
Thanks, Sarah and Tani for organising this event. And thanks to my colleagues, Kevin and Lauren, and also the other amazing 10 lead authors who contribute this chapter. The word coordinating lead author just means that. The assessment was actually done collectively by the entire team. We also had input on specific areas where we brought in additional experts. They're called contributing authors, and there were 41 of them, including 3 Indigenous Australian and 1 Indigenous New Zealand contributing author. We also had 2 extraordinary chapter scientists, Esther Onyango and Belinda, who are from New Zealand, who really provided us with great support. So it's very much, these things are very much a team effort. But I would just like to say that, you know, I would really encourage everyone listening to read the summary for policymakers. It's 30 odd pages long. It's intentionally written. It's a translation really of the scientific assessments into what's meant to be plainer English and more policy relevant language. And I would encourage you to do a deep dive into the underlying report. It is over 3,600 pages long. Definitely read chapter 11. It's only 102 pages long, a much quicker read. But there's a lot of information in there which I'm sure will be useful to you all for many, many years to come. And if I could just also add to the list of what's new compared to 2014, I think it's also a systems approach. So especially in our chapter, we defined risks in terms of the risk to a human or natural system. And again, as Lauren highlighted, this also helps when we start to think about adaptation and solutions for addressing those risks, to try and take a more systemic approach to the solutions as well. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Brendan. Thank you so much. A virtual applause for our speakers this week. It's really been a fantastic set of webinars, and we will make the recordings available on the Climate Systems Hub website and on the Climate Action Beacon website. So thanks very much. We look forward to seeing you at the next event that we might host. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.